Welcome to What's the World Coming to? What does the Bible say about the last days? As you know, my conviction is that the Bible says a great deal about not only the last days, but also, I think, strongly infers that we are living in just such times. And that's why today what I want to talk about is the city of Jerusalem. More importantly, or more specifically, what is so important about Jerusalem? Why is it looked on as being so special and significant, especially to the world's three largest monotheistic religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism? What is it about this city that really captures the mind, the imagination, and in many ways, even the heart of people around the world? Well, first of all, we have to understand that historically, even in the present time, that Jerusalem, the city, is really not a place of any overt or evident significance. I mean by that, when you take away the religious feelings towards the city that Islamic people, Jewish people, and Christians feel towards the city, it really is just another city with some very interesting ancient architecture. But the reality is it doesn't have any kind of inherent value in and of itself, in that it's not a great population center. It's not a great industrial center. It's not a great economic center. Um, it has no great rivers, no impressive mountains. Even there are no real noticeable geographical features. Of course, we can talk about things like the Rift Valley or the Dead Sea, and those are pretty significant, but those are 12, 15 miles away from the city of Jerusalem and aren't readily observable. And so even from the point of view of saying, what's the point of view? If we go back even to ancient times, we find that there were no major travel routes. In other words, they had the sea, the Via Maritima, which went along the coastline, but that's nowhere close to Jerusalem. It's 60 miles up in the mountains. And then you had the King's Highway that went through the desert and up to the Jordan Valley. Again, it was many miles away. So it was really very out of the way, isolated location. And oftentimes the great empires, when they went on campaign, would travel past it. They wouldn't go against it unless they had some very definitive or specific reason, as Sennacherib did in the time of King Hezekiah, when Hezekiah had led a rebellion against the Assyrian Empire. So as a result, Sennacherib thought it was really incumbent upon him. It was really incumbent upon him, I should say, to conquer this city. And ironically, of all the cities of Judah, some 46 that were conquered by Sennacherib, there was only one that he didn't conquer, and that was the city of Jerusalem, because God put his hand over it and spared it and brought his judgment upon Sennacherib. So again, the question is, why do the three world monotheistic religions, which represent close to a third to a half of the population of the world, why do they view this city as being so very, very specific? Now, talking about Islam, what kind of claim do they have to Jerusalem as one of their holy cities? In Islam, we know that they have two other cities they consider to be holy. There's the city of Mecca, and that's where, of course, the Kabbalah is. That's where they march around in their celebration every year. That's considered the holiest site in Islam. And then there's also the city of Medina, which has some relevance to the founding of the Islamic religion. But also they claim that Jerusalem is part of their spiritual heritage, the third holiest site in all of Islam. But it's interesting because keep in mind, Muhammad had never been to Jerusalem in his lifetime. There is no historical records. In fact, the only claim that he was in the city of Jerusalem is really more mythological. It's something taken from a legend from the Hadiths or the teachings. But the reality is that the only reference they have is to what's called the farthest mosque, or Al-Aqsa, which is the name of the mosque that's on the Temple Mount today. They call it the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And that the meaning of that is the farthest mosque, the mosque that is farthest away from Mecca and Medina. And the way the story goes is supposedly Muhammad was taken up in the spirit and he was taken to this farthest mosque. It doesn't name in the Quran where that is, but simply says he went to the farthest mosque. It was later, long after Muhammad was dead, that a Umayyad caliph, that means a king, a ruler over Islamic nations. This Umayyad Caliph basically declared that Jerusalem, which was under his domain, was the farthest mosque, and from that point on, it took on that identity. So it's not like the Jewish, or the Islamic people have any kind of a historical connection to Jerusalem. They don't have even a religious or textual connection. It's based upon basically a fable that was created in the 8th or 9th century in order to validate making it the center of this particular caliph's kingdom. But to the Jews, it's something quite different. It's obviously very significant. We find that the name Jerusalem appears from Genesis on through the Old Testament over and over again. And also we find, of course, within the New Testament. Why is it so special to the Jews? Well, basically, it was on Mount Moriah, or really the mountains of Moriah. It's kind of a misnomer, a way that we think of a mountain, we think of a single peak that rises up. But in the Middle East, they'll have mountains which are basically running ranges of mountains, and the mountains of Moriah run through this area. And of course, the Temple Mount is right on part of, or one of the spurs of Mount Moriah. And it's there that we find that in Genesis chapter 22, that Abraham took his son Isaac and was willing to offer him in sacrifice to the Lord. And of course, the Lord stayed his hand. But one of the things he said about Abraham's offering up his son, his only begotten son, was he said, one day this event will be seen in the mountain of the Lord. And so Jewish tradition and Christian tradition all go back and say, this was the moment in which God sanctified this particular piece of ground. It was there that Abraham encountered Melchizedek, who it says was a priest of the Most High God. And Melchizedek was a ruler over this, and he becomes a type of the Messiah. And then additionally, we know that it was there that David, and later on also Herod, built the temples that were resting on that same site. So there have been 2 previous temples that were built there, the first being the temple built by Solomon. But it was David who identified the threshing floor as the site where the altar was going to be built. And that threshing floor, I believe, is still visible outside the Dome of the Rock that sits on the place where the temple once stood in those days. But the simple fact is that going throughout the Old Testament, we find that God says that he maintains a special focus upon the city of Jerusalem, or that locale. For example, in 1 Kings in chapter 9, verse 3, when Solomon is dedicating the temple to the Lord says to him, "My eyes and my heart will be there for all time." Now, this is one of those things I find interesting. When he says all time, it means for everlasting. It doesn't mean just for a period of time or when the Jews are in the land. It means for all time, my eyes. In other words, God says, I will pay special attention to this place throughout all human history. And it's interesting why, because he essentially is going to not only begin the work of redemption, but also conclude it on the Temple Mount, as we'll see further on. But also we find in places like Psalm 132 and verse 13, it reads as follows. It says, "The Lord has chosen Zion," which refers to the Mount Moriah, where the Temple Mount was. He has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his dwelling place. "This is my resting place," quote, "forever. Here I will dwell, and for I have desired it." So God says, this mountain, this place, this location is where I will dwell because I have desired to dwell it, and I've declared it as holy. In fact, in Psalm 2:8, he literally calls it my holy hill, Zion. So that throughout the Old Testament, we find that this strong emphasis upon this one piece of geographical land that God says, I have a special concern about this property. Then you go to 1 Kings chapter 11. And he refers to Jerusalem, the city where I have put my name. Now, it's interesting, the idea of God putting his name. One of the names of God is El Shaddai. And the symbol of El Shaddai, which means the Almighty God, is basically the shin. And the shin looks like 3 fingers being held out. And if you look at the city of Jerusalem from overhead, what you see is that you have 3 valleys that are surrounded by mountains. The first valley is called the Gihon Valley, or Gihon, which runs from north to the south. And then on the other side, you have the Kidron Valley that also runs from north towards the south, and they intersect. The Hinnom and the Kidron intersect at where the Pool of Siloam is in the southernmost tip of the city of David, of ancient Jerusalem. But between them all runs another valley, which is hard to see because it's been built over through the centuries, which was called the Central Valley, or the Tyropian Valley, the Valley of the Cheesemaker. But what it does is it forms a shin, or a symbol of the name of God, that's placed upon those hills. It's also, we find in passages like Zechariah 2:8, where God says, anyone who touches him, speaking of Jerusalem, is touching the apple of his eye. Now, the apple of your eye refers to the pupil, the most sensitive and important part of your eyeball. And he says it's like you're touching a place that you should never touch. So to come against Jerusalem or to harm it is something that can only be happen if God allows it, which he does on a few occasions. But it's ultimately God saying, I'm letting something that will temporarily blind me to the holiness of this place, and I'll bring judgment upon it because they have so desecrated and blasphemed my name by doing things on this mount that I had forbidden them to do, which includes child sacrifice, by the way. But also in Ezekiel 5:5, the prophet says, this is Jerusalem, and God says, I have set her in the center of the nations with countries all around her. Now, one thing we know is the earth has no geographical center. I mean, it's a sphere, and there's no one place you could point to and say, this is the exact center of the earth. But what God is saying is, I have chosen it to make the central object of focus, so that throughout history, Jerusalem has repeatedly been the center of geopolitical struggles. Now, it certainly wasn't the center of Asia, Europe, and Africa at one point, if you wanted to draw a line between those three continents where a major significant part of ancient history took place. It is really literally in the center of that. But more importantly, he said it'll become, as he says later on in Zechariah chapter 12, it will become this troublesome stone in the midst of the nations. In other words, it's going to be always a source of controversy and conflict and difficulty. And it certainly has been that, not only in past history, but once again, in the present time, we find that Jerusalem is a troubling stone in the midst of the nations, as one administration after another has attempted to find a way of creating peace between Israel and their neighbors. And the biggest point of controversy is that Jerusalem is now occupied and in the possession of the Jewish people. Now, we might wonder why that would matter to the Islamic people. Well, the first is that they have declared it as being one of their most holy sites. But secondly, one of the concepts within Islam is that any property, any piece of real estate that once was owned by a Muslim now forever has to be in the hands of a Muslim. And if it's not, they have to wage jihad, or struggles, what that word means, struggle, sometimes in verbal struggle, sometimes in emotional struggle, but really not even spiritual struggle, but physical conflict that they have to go and fight to retake that territory. And that's why, in many ways, that there will never be an acceptance by the Muslim world of Israel controlling Jerusalem, because they claim it as being theirs and feel that they're under direct responsibility and command by God, their God, by Allah, to retake this area and make it their own. And so all of these things become huge factors, not only for the Jews, but also for the Muslims. But it's interesting also from a prophetic point of view, because when the Old Testament talks about the millennial reign of Christ, the time when the Messiah will reign over the world, he focuses the center of that kingdom as being Jerusalem. For example, in Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 and 3, it says, "It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house," speaking of Mount Zion, which is where the Temple Mount is, the top of Mount Moriah, "shall be established on the top of the mountains and shall be exalted above all the hills." Not so much that it would be higher, but it would be more important than any other place. And he says, all nations shall flow to it. Many people shall come and say, "Come and let us go up to the mount of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob," which can only be the temple of the Jewish people. "And he will teach us his ways, and we shall walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So here again, even in Jewish view of end times, Jewish eschatology, if you will, even within Jewish eschatology, the idea that Jerusalem is going to be the central focus of the Messianic kingdom. And we read the same thing, of course, in Micah in the 4th chapter, where he says, "Now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains and shall be exalted above the hills, and people shall flow into it." So even within Judaism today, particularly in any kind of observant form of Judaism, and there are a lot of different variations when I say observant Judaism. And what I mean by that term is there's Jews who take the Old Testament literally and seriously and feel they're under divine obligation to obey it. And I say that just simply because, if I can kind of parenthetically add, there are a lot of people who have Jewish ethnicity who do not have a Jewish faith. In other words, they are identified as a Jew by their racial or ethnic designation, their heritage, but they don't see themselves as under any obligation to follow the God of Israel or to submit to what the Old Testament teaches, beyond its moral injunctions, which most of them do embrace. But to say all of that, within those observant Judaism, there's this idea that the temple needs to be rebuilt. It has to be rebuilt. Now, there's even disagreement amongst the observant Jews over how that's supposed to happen, because there are those who say we are under commandment to go and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. They're referred to sometimes as the temple faithful. And these are the people who every year will take a cornerstone that they've already cut out, and they will try to carry it up on the Temple Mount. And they're usually stopped by the Israeli authorities because it would lead to another outbreak of violence and riots among them and the Arab neighbors that they have. But also they're busily involved in, they've built a golden menorah made of solid gold, costing quite a bit of money. I think initially it was about $1 million. It's probably worth 10 times that amount today, but it's a massive giant menorah made of solid gold. And many other things they've made, like the garments of the priests. They even have a school for training priests. They call it the Yeshiva of Kohen, because if your name is Kohen, it means that you're a descendant of the Kohathites, and the Kohathites were the priests in the days of the temple. And so they're training men who have that genealogical descent, not only the same name, but they actually trace their genealogical background, their DNA, and they are training those who are willing to prepare for the day when the temple will be rebuilt and they can carry out the services of the temple. So there are those observant Jews who believe literally that they are called to do everything they can for as long as they live to build a temple on the Temple Mount. There are other Jews who, particularly those who don't find themselves making aliyah or returning back to Israel, who believe that Israel is in sin, that national Israel as exists today is a secular republic, and they believe that this republic is a sin against the God of Israel because only the Messiah, they believe, has the right to rebuild the temple. So if you ever see these demonstrations by these Palestinian supporters, these Hamas supporters, and they're saying from the river to the sea, and you see some Orthodox Jews walking amongst them, those are the people who literally believe that the Israel that's in the nation today is an abomination. They're in sin because only the Messiah is allowed to rebuild the temple, and then they'll come back. But see, there is one thing that each side of this equation has, and that's the idea that Jerusalem is ultimately the place where the temple of God will be rebuilt and will usher in the beginning of the end times. And so they have that in agreement. They just have a disagreement of the time and place and manner in which that's supposed to take place. So you find that even within secular Judaism, there's a strong connection with the idea of Jerusalem in the same way that Americans might find a strong connection to a place like Washington, D.C., or even Gettysburg or some other place where blood was shed and the ground had become hallowed by the sacrifice of patriots. Well, they have that same feeling because that's their ancestral home. That's where the kingdom of David was established most fully over all of Israel. That was the first capital of their nation. And it is now, once again, after 3,000 years, the capital of Israel once again. And I would say that even amongst the secularist Jews, the non-observant Jews, they would say that there's no way we're ever giving Jerusalem back. And so we understand the tension that exists there because you have two parties who refuse to compromise in any meaningful way. And yet, ironically, one of the things that's really confusing is Jesus said that Jerusalem would be trampled down by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles was fulfilled. It's interesting because the only piece of property in Jerusalem that is fully under the control of Muslims is the Temple Mount. Because when the Israel captured Jerusalem after the 67 war, in order to avoid conflict and hopefully to lead to peace, Moshe Dayan, the commander of the Israeli force at the time, made an agreement with the governing authority of the Temple Mount, the Waqf, who oversee the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. He made an agreement that he would let them continue to run and control the Temple Mount. And they've maintained that position to this day, so that when somebody like myself goes up to the Temple Mount, we have to pass through a security check, and we have to submit to all the restrictions that the Muslims would place upon people who are visiting there. We're not able to take our Bibles. We're not able to teach. We're not able to do any kind of religious activity whatsoever, because they consider that to be an insult, and that's the little power they still exercise. So when we talk about Jerusalem no longer being trampled on by Gentiles, the question we have, and there's some discussion about this, is Jerusalem yet fully under the control of the Israelis? I personally believe that's not going to happen until the tribulation period, after the Battle of Gog and Magog. I personally believe the Battle of Gog and Magog, I referred to it as really the death of, maybe more accurately, the significant diminishing of Islam as a religious force in the world, because God himself will testify against their false worship. But be that as it may, then the Jews will be assisted by the Antichrist, who in the first half of the tribulation comes across as a really good guy, and he'll help them to rebuild the third temple, which is going to be the temple that he desecrates, which is, again, where it becomes significant to us as Christians. So I've talked about how it's significant to the Muslim world, how it's significant to the Jewish world, but why is it significant to the Christian world? Well, first of all, we know that Jesus spent a significant amount of his public ministry in the city of Jerusalem. When we look at John's gospel, we have to realize that pretty much half of his gospel talks about events taking place in the city of Jerusalem. If it wasn't for John's gospel, we would know very little about Jesus's ministry in Jerusalem, because the synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke tend to focus significantly, about 80 or 90% of their data is dealing with the ministry in Galilee and not with his ministry in Jerusalem. So you can get, really, if you just read the first three gospels, you feel like Jerusalem is kind of an afterthought of Jesus' ministry, aside from the fact that he was betrayed and crucified there. And yet when we read John's gospel, we see very clearly that Jesus was in Jerusalem for most of the feasts, through most of the years, that the 3.5 years he ministered. And of course, it takes greatest significance because that's where he was betrayed, and that's where he was crucified. It's also significant, particularly we see it in Luke's gospel, where on 3 different occasions, Jesus prophetically foretold that the city was going to be destroyed. In fact, when his disciples are marveling at the beauty of the city, and this comes out very clearly in Matthew 24, and they're looking at the grandeur of the Temple Mount, which at that time was probably the most significant, magnificent, largest building that existed on the planet. And that's not an exaggeration, because Herod was a wealthy builder. He was famous and respected throughout the entire Roman world. He sponsored Olympic Games. He donated money to building all sorts of projects for the emperor around the empire. I mean, Herod the Great wasn't just big guy in the name, in the time of or in the purview of the biblical world. He was a significant politician and statesman, an extremely wealthy guy in the ancient world. He was kind of like the Elon Musk of the first century. And therefore, he was entrusted by the Romans to rule over this very important empire, which at that time was also one of the wealthiest empires and had some of the greatest natural resources, because it had salt. The idea of salt is where we get our word salary, because Roman soldiers sometimes were paid in blocks of salt, and Herod had under his disposal an entire lake called the Dead Sea, which was filled with salt, and it still is a source of great wealth and treasure to the Jews today, as they pull out something 30 or 40 different natural resources of minerals that come from the lake. But he had that great resource. He had the balsam trees that made the precious perfume. He had the date trees, which produced the honey of the ancient and Roman world. There were so many things. Essentially, it was a major trade hub. The city of Caesarea was probably the second most important port in the Mediterranean world. I mean, there was just a whole list of things that made that his kingdom a very wealthy and important kingdom. And when he built the temple in Jerusalem, he spent a fortune hiring 10,000 workmen to rebuild it. And keep in mind, they couldn't use a chisel in ear of the mountain itself or the temple itself. So they literally had to cut each piece, mark it, and put it in place by carrying it up on the Temple Mount. So even if you've gone to Jerusalem, you've seen what we've referred to as the Wailing Wall, which is somewhat of a misnomer, but basically that wall, it's merely an exterior retaining wall to the temple. You could take 5 great pyramids from Egypt and you could put them on the top of the temple platform today. So Herod not only magnified the size of the temple by expanding it a great deal, but he also decorated it with great fortune, and it was one of the most beautiful and majestic buildings that existed on the planet at that time. This is before Rome had ever burnt and been rebuilt, because at that time most of Rome was built out of wood and was not nearly as spectacular as Jerusalem was. So keep in mind, when Jesus' disciples looked at the Temple Mount and were marveling at its size and its beauty and its majesty, and Jesus says something that had to be so unthinkable to them. He says that not one stone will be left upon itself. Now, I've had people say, well, if not one stone, what about the Wailing Wall? Well, that's still there. That's not the temple. That's a retaining wall. If you go outside the retaining wall, you'll find that there are piles of the stones that were part of the temple, these massive, huge stones that were literally toppled and poured over the other side. It's hard to imagine, but if you've ever been to Jerusalem and you've seen the eastern wall where the eastern gate is, and if you stand on the Mount of Olives, which is east of Jerusalem, and you look at the Temple Mount, you can see how steep the valley is. But in the days of Jesus, the level of the wall was 80 feet lower than it is today. That's how much rubble was pushed off the Temple Mount into the valley, the Kidron Valley, and leaving not one single stone unturned. In fact, there's a legend that comes to us through Josephus that when the Romans burnt the temple, and some people wonder, how can a stone temple burnt? It's really interesting because the temple was filled with all sorts of wood and material, cloth and so forth. And the story is that a Roman soldier took a torch and he threw it into the temple. It caught everything inside on fire. And the temple itself was like an oven, and the temperature rose to like 2,000, 2,500 degrees as it raged inside of this stone enclosure. And the temple literally exploded. It literally shattered the stones and toppled everything, but also because it was covered on the roof, on the walls, and on the floor in gold, that the Roman soldiers later on came and were commanded to scrape the gold that had melted and gone into the stones, scrape it off the ground so it be carried away to Rome, which, by the way, we found out not too many years ago that the gold that was taken from the temple in Jerusalem at that time was what was used to build the Colosseum in Rome. It's funny how those things kind of go in a circle. So that basically this Temple Mount was so magnificent, and it seemed incomprehensible to Jesus' disciples that this temple could be even brokered or broken down, because it was such a massive building and in itself was much of a fortress. In fact, towards the end, before it was destroyed in 70 AD, it had become pretty much the last fortress standing as they were resisting the Roman invasion. But this is one of the things, as I go back to something I mentioned earlier in Luke chapter 21, where Jesus says in verse 24 that Jerusalem will be trampled down by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Now remember, Paul, in writing to the Romans in Romans 11:25, makes the same reference, uses the same phrase. He says, a hardness has come upon Israel, the Jewish people, until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. In other words, when Paul was writing that, Jerusalem as a city was still intact. The temple was still standing. But he said there's going to come a time where Israel is going to find that the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. And that would become really anchored when the city is destroyed, because Jesus foretold in Luke 21 that the city would be overtaken, it would be destroyed, would be trampled by Gentiles until when? Until God had turned back to focusing upon Israel. In other words, the time of the Gentiles is the time in which God is really focusing his attention on reaching the Gentile world for Christ. It's the spreading of the gospel to every nation. But once that has been accomplished, and I would argue that that day has been accomplished, not everybody has heard it, not everybody has believed it, but the gospel clearly has spanned the globe and can be found in every part of the world. He says, once that has happened, I will return and begin to focus upon the nation of Israel. I will begin to focus upon Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. And that's why I believe we're living in those times as we look at what's going on in Jerusalem today, fulfilling again Zechariah's prophecy that it would be this burdensome stone in the midst of the world, and everybody who touches it would be frustrated. In fact, it's interesting how in Luke 21, Luke goes on to say that the world would be in a state of perplexity. You know what perplexity is? A situation where you have problems that you can't figure out how to fix. And even though we find that we're closer to peace in the Middle East than we have seen, certainly in my lifetime, the reality is it's not likely it's ever going to be there, be fully accomplished or to be finished, because as long as Iran is standing, as long as Turkey has this Erdogan and the Muslim Brotherhood running their geopolitics, as long as the Syrians are controlled by Sunni Muslims who have the same disposition, where ISIS and Islamic Jihad and Hamas all are really of the same mentality. In other words, the idea of retaking Jerusalem is so hardwired into the mindset of the Muslim world, especially in the Middle East, that it's not likely that any kind of peace will ever come to any lasting endeavor. Because as I mentioned before, the Islamic people, if they're truly fundamental in their faith, which about 20% of them are, can never stop pursuing the goal of retaking Jerusalem and making it part of the Muslim world once again, which means they might allow Israelis to live there, but they will not allow them to be in control. They will be second and third and fourth class citizens there if they allow them to survive at all. But what's really interesting is because when we look at the end times, one of the things we find that Paul says is that Jerusalem is going to be ground zero. And it goes back to what Jesus said in Matthew 24, where he said, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel. Now, the prophet Daniel spoke about this abominable thing, this desecration of the temple that was going to take place. He talked about it in chapter 9 of Daniel. He talked about it in chapter 11 and verse 31, again in chapter 12 and verse 11. All these things he said was going to happen, which in Daniel's mind, in the minds of the Jews even today, was kind of like the most unbelievable thing, that somebody would desecrate the most holiest place in the Jewish world by basically offering unsanctified sacrifices, trampling on it with priests or leaders who weren't called to be in that role, and most importantly, setting up an image and declaring themselves to be God in place of the God of Israel. Now, there are people who are of the belief that this has already been historically fulfilled. They're referred to as preterists. The only problem is that when Jesus makes this statement, it's long after the time of Daniel. It's long after the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, who desecrated the temple, which they oftentimes point to. It's long after even the Romans eventually sieged the place and destroyed it. The whole point is that Jesus says it's something that's yet to happen in the future. And so I think that we need to really realize Jesus speaks of this thing that would desecrate the temple as a future event, not something that we should be waiting for. In fact, Paul even makes reference to this in 2 Timothy chapter 2, where in verses 3 and 4, he's saying that the son of perdition, speaking of the Antichrist, Revelation calls him the beast, he says, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God and showing himself that he is God. Now, this is the very same thing that John is speaking of when he says in Revelation chapter 11 And he's recounting the vision that the Lord had given to him. He says in verse 1, "Then I was given a reed like a measuring rod, and the angel stood saying, 'Rise and measure the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship there.'" When is this happening? This is happening with the third temple. Now, again, preterists to say, well, this is all referring to the Roman period. But in 90 AD, when John is writing this, the temple had been gone for 20 years. So he can't be speaking about the former temple that was built by Ezra and Nehemiah and then remodeled by Herod, because it's gone. He has to be speaking about a third temple, much like Ezekiel speaks of a millennial temple that's yet to come. But the whole point is he's speaking of a third temple, and he says, I was given a rod in the midst of the tribulation, after the Antichrist has revealed himself, and I was told to measure the temple. And he says, but leave the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles. Now, some people take that and they argue that the third temple that will be built during the tribulation period will be built either to the north or the south of the current Dome of the Rock. Right now, I think that would be completely unacceptable, but it's a possibility, and there's some valid arguments behind that. I personally think it's going to be rebuilt over the Dome of the Rock, but, I could be wrong because, again, we're talking about things that are future and things that only God knows for certain. But he basically says when the courtyard has been given to Gentiles, there was always the court of the Gentiles that was outside the Temple Mount, that a Gentile could go so far until he hit a little barrier, basically a stone wall about, waist high that went around the entire sacred area of the temple. And it is signed there in 3 different languages that if you cross, it was in Greek, Jew, Hebrew, and in Latin, and it said if you pass into this area, you do so at the risk of your own life. You could be killed if you're a Gentile for desecrating holy ground. So there was always the court of the Gentiles that was surrounded out the outer court of the temple itself. But whether he's referring to that or something else, we don't know for sure. But as we go on, he says, and it shall be given to Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. The Gentiles will control it for 42 months, which is 3.5 years, the first half of the tribulation. And then he says in verse 8, when they finish their testimony, speaking about the 2 witnesses who are proclaiming the gospel in the first 3.5 years of the tribulation period, that they're overcome. This says the beast that that ascends out of the bottomless pit will make war against them, overcome them, and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where our Lord was crucified. Now, why does he call it Sodom and Egypt? Because he says during that time, Jerusalem will have been so corrupted by the sins of the Antichrist and his system that he says it'll be as evil as Sodom, it'll be as evil as Egypt. And then he goes on to say, but it's the place where our Lord was crucified, which can only be one location, and that's Jerusalem. And that's why when we begin to look at the scriptures, we find that not only in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament, it directs our attention towards the city of Jerusalem as being the place where human history will come to an end as we know it. It'll be the place, in fact, we're told that Christ will return. In Zechariah chapter 14, verse 4, he says, in that day his feet, speaking the Messiah's feet, will stand on the Mount of Olives. We read the same thing in Ezekiel in chapter 42, where he's speaking of this temple that's built, and he says, the place of my throne and the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell in the midst of the children of Israel forever. No more shall the house of Israel defile my holy name, nor their kings by their harlotry, or with the carcasses of their kings on their high places. In other words, he says, I'm going to make the Temple Mount holy and sacred once again during the millennial reign. But again, there's only one place that can be fulfilled, and that is in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, which called also Mount Zion, the place where the temple once stood. And a third temple will be built, and it will be destroyed to be replaced by a fourth temple, which is the one described by Ezekiel in Ezekiel 40 through 48, the millennial temple that's described there. But it's also, we find in Acts chapter 1, After the resurrection of Jesus, one of the things that's so amazing is Jesus appears to his disciples numerous times. We know of at least 12 to 13 different times that Jesus appeared. Paul tells us of one occasion that we don't have recorded in the Gospels, but in writing 1 Corinthians 15, he speaks of Jesus appearing to over 500 people at one time. These are following his resurrection on the third day. And the first time he appeared was on that evening, that Sunday evening in the upper room. He appeared to them again the next evening. And again, it tells us over the next 40 days between Passover and Pentecost or Shavuot, between those two periods, the Feast of Harvest, we find that Jesus appeared some 12, 13, maybe more times to the disciples to really give ample proof to them that he was indeed risen from the dead. But it goes on that when Jesus took them up to the Mount of Olives, where they met for him the last time, and then he ascends into heaven, listen to what the scripture says about it. It says, "Now, when he had spoken these things, in which he gave his final instructions, the first part of chapter 1 of Acts, to his disciples to go into all the world and preach the gospel, beginning in Jerusalem, going to Samaria, and then into all the world." Okay, this concentric spread of the gospel around the world. And then he says he takes them up to the Mount of Olives, the top of the Mount of Olives, and he says to them, uh, and he was taken up while they watched, and a cloud received him out of their sight. He ascended from earth into heaven to be with the Father and to sit on his throne in heaven. It goes on and says, and while they looked up steadfastly toward heaven, as he went up, behold, two men stood by them in white apparel, which apparently are angels, who also said, quote, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand here gazing up into heaven? This same Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will so come in like manner as you have seen him go into heaven." So here again, the angel is saying what Zechariah said in chapter 14 of his prophecy, that the Messiah is taken up to heaven from the Mount of Olives. It says he will return and set his foot on the Mount of Olives again at his second coming. Zechariah goes on to say that when he sets his foot on the Mount of Olives, it will split the Mount of Olives. And basically, there will be a crevice that will run all the way to the Mediterranean and all the way down to the Dead Sea Valley. And the water of the ocean will flow into inland and fill the Dead Sea with water that are filled with fish. And in those days, they'll be fishing on the shores of the Dead Sea. That's the prophecy as it was given by Zechariah. Now, so as we look at all of these passages, I think it's really impossible. It's not really even reasonable to say that Jerusalem has no future significance or even present significance. It plays in centrally to everything that Jesus said about his coming, and as well as what the prophets said about the end times. And so when people say, what's the big deal about Jerusalem? The big deal is that God has a right of ownership. Excuse me. God has a right of ownership over that piece of geography, and one day he's going to come back and take claim of it. And he also tells us that it's going to be in Jewish hands, no longer trodden down by Gentiles. It'll be in Jewish hands. So again, as we've talked before, there are those who argue, well, the Jews today in Israel have nothing to do with the Jews of the last time or the Jews of the Old Testament or even the Jews of the New Testament. I would say to them, you're incorrect, because the reason why the Jews have continued to be a presence in the world in their ethnic and religious identity is because God has reserved them for the end times. Where do I get that idea? Well, let's go back to Leviticus chapter 26, if you will, for a moment. If you read Leviticus 26, one of the things you find is that God is really giving a warning of blessings and cursings. I mean, he says that if you obey my commands and you do the things I tell you to do, I will bless you and I'll bless the land. The rains will come at the right time. Your harvest will be bountiful. Your lambs won't lose their calves. Your sheep won't lose their lambs. Your cows won't lose their calves. You'll basically be a people who will be prosperous, and you'll be blessed on every way. You'll sit under your tree and eat the fruits of your figs and your almonds and your pomegranates, and on and on and on it goes. It's basically saying, I will bless you beyond anything you can imagine if you are faithful and obedient to me. But God also knew that because they are sinners like you and me, that faithfulness is something we struggle with. And so he said, if you don't remain faithful to me, I will begin to bring a series of sequential judgments upon you. And they're really like these 7 different things he said will happen to you, that they'll face droughts, they'll face famines, they'll face diseases, they'll face invasions, they'll face captivity. He goes through this whole thing and he says, finally, he says, when you become totally recalcitrant, you finally come to the place where you will not submit and obey, then I will carry you away into captivity. In fact, it reads this way in verse 42 of chapter 26. He says, when I have turned their hostility, that is their hostility towards the God of Israel, when I turn their hostility back on them and have brought them to the land of their enemies, that means their captivity dispersed around the world. Then at last their stubborn hearts will be humbled and they will pay for their sins. Now their stubborn hearts will be humbled. I was talking with a friend of mine, well, not a deep friend, an acquaintance who is an Israeli archaeologist and used to be the curator of the Israeli Museum. And he was saying something in our casual conversation. He said that there is a way that which Jewish people tend to be, they tend to make fun of themselves. They tend to, they tend to recognize their fallibility and their weaknesses and their problems. And so he says, we make jokes about ourselves all the time. It's not surprising that many of the best comedians that we have ever seen in our country and around the world have been people from Jewish backgrounds, because they have learned to be self-deprecating. They learned to make fun of themselves. But he said, now my Arab business people that I work with, they have no sense of humor because theirs is an honor culture, and you do not dare make fun of them or criticize them because they will become deeply offended. But we Jews, we criticize ourselves all the time. And as I was thinking about it, I was reflecting back on what Moses said in Leviticus 26. He said, when you come to that place where you have been humbled, you no longer think that you're the biggest, the strongest, the best, the most important. You begin to realize that you are a people who have been pretty well decimated because of your sinful rebellion against God, and that your existence is really an expression of the kindness and the mercy of God. And the idea of being exalted, even though it's spoken of in your scriptures, seems improbable and unlikely. And which it kind of explains why there's a whole sector of Judaism that believes that only the Messiah can restore the Jewish nation and the Jewish hegemony and rulership over the world. It's certainly not going to happen with them. Now, I know there's people saying, well, the Rothschilds and the Jews control all the money markets and all these things in the world. Whether the things are true or not, I can't tell you. I mean, I have no way of validating or not, other than the fact that probably half of the top 20 wealthiest people in the world are Jewish. Probably doesn't help the argument. But the whole point is, are they the ones who are controlling everything that goes in the world? If they are, they're pretty bad at it. That's all I can say. But I think that what's really interesting is when we look at Israel as a nation today, you've got 10 million people living in a place that's hardly any bigger than New Jersey, and who are surrounded by enemies who number in 300 million, and they're hated around the world. And anti-Semitism has become a common practice on just about every capital on the planet. You realize that the idea that they're going to take control of the world and rule it on their own is pretty darn stinking small, because even the United States, with all of its power, has never been able to control the entire planet, nor has any great empire before them. So I get the idea that only the Messiah can make it happen. And in a sense, that is only after the Antichrist has presented himself as being the Messiah, and many Jews believe he is, and he sets up his capital in Jerusalem and begins to exalt the nation, and then eventually basically tells them, if you want to keep on functioning on this level, you're going to have to worship me as God. And that's a deal breaker for those who have an honest faith towards the God of Israel. Because I believe those people who have come to faith in Christ have already been taken from the earth, from the rapture, from the 144,000, for those who believe the testimony of the 2 witnesses, from those who are decapitated because of their faith and refuse to receive the mark of the beast. I mean, I think pretty much there isn't much left to argue. There will be, I believe, Jewish people who will embrace the Antichrist, because I know Jewish people right now who are embracing the ways of the Antichrist, but that's another conversation. But God says, when I brought Israel to the lowest point they can possibly brought to, then listen what he says. Then I will remember my covenant with Jacob, and my covenant with Isaac, and my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. Not just any land. When he says the land, always in Scripture, it's referring to the promised land, the land of Israel, with Jerusalem as its central capital. He says, but the land must be abandoned to enjoy its years of Sabbath rest as it lies deserted. Literally, it was deserted for thousands of years. Oh, yeah, there were Arab communities, villages here and there, but Jerusalem was a really backwater of a town for many, many years until the Jews began to return into the land. And even then, they were outside of Jerusalem. It was only after the Israelis took the city and began to make it into the major metropolitan area it is today that that was no longer the case. But the simple fact is, it lay abandoned. When Mark Twain traveled through the Middle East, in his lifetime in the middle of the 19th century, he basically said it was a barren waste. There was nothing there but wandering nomads. It was literally a desolate place, an abandoned place. And that only changed back in the 1880s when the Jews began to return to Israel because of the persecutions they were experiencing in Europe, especially Eastern Europe. And so, as I shared a post about Tel Aviv and about its founding in the 1880s, and then there were people who responded and said, no, Israel, the Jews stole Tel Aviv from the Arabs. Tel Aviv didn't even exist before the Jews began to rebuild it, build a city on the sand and the beaches on the area of Tel Aviv. They bought the land, paying many times what it was worth in gold to the Turks who owned it. They were the landlords. It was part of Turkey, not part of any kind of fictional Palestine. And they built a city there. And it was much later, after the 67 war, that Joppa became incorporated into Greater Jerusalem or Greater Tel Aviv. And so, all of that misinformation finds a lot of willing and hearing ears, but the fact is, it's not the facts. And you could figure this out by just Googling it or looking it up on Wikipedia. You have to be purposely ignorant of those facts in order to believe such a fantasy. But back to the issue at hand. But he goes on to say, the land must be abandoned to enjoy its years of Sabbath. Keep in mind, every seventh year the land was supposed to lie dormant. We have no record of the Jews ever faithfully doing that. But he goes on, at last, the people will pay for their sins, for they have continually rejected my regulations, despised my decrees. But despite all of this, and in others, despite all of their sinful rebellion and disobedience and abominations, he says, I will not utterly reject or despise them while they're in exile in the land of their enemies. So those people who say the Jews today are no longer the covenant people of Israel apparently haven't read this, because I can't offer any other explanation. The fact that God says, I will never utterly abandon them. In fact, he goes on, I will not cancel my covenant with them. So again, the Roman Catholic theology that says that God took the promises, the covenant that he gave to Israel, and he took it away from them, and he gave it to the Roman Catholic Church, and therefore Rome is the New Jerusalem, and so it goes, are just really full of, well, let's just say that they aren't saying things that have any biblical power behind them. They're just things that are made up to make Rome feel like it's more important than what it really is. In fact, he goes on, he says, not only will I not utterly reject them, he says, I will not cancel my covenant with them by wiping them out, for I am the Lord their God. I won't cancel my covenant. So the covenant has not been canceled. God says, I will never cancel it. He says his covenant was with them was forever, everlasting. So the idea that somehow God has given up on the Jewish people, Paul explains it in Romans 9, 10, 11 in detail, and it's so easy that anybody could read it. He says, yeah, they're in unbelief. Yeah, they're in disobedience. Yeah, they're in rebellion. But in the last days, he says, all Israel will be saved. When are those last days? Well, I think it's the period of the tribulation, because the prophets referred to the tribulation as being the time of Jacob's trouble. Jacob is a euphemism for Israel, a time in which God will finish his work with Israel and bring the remnant of Israel to faith, and the rest will be subject to the judgment that happens in the last 3.5 years of the tribulation. He says, for their sake, I will remember my ancient covenant with their ancestors, which I brought out of the land of Egypt in the sight of all the nations, that I might be their God, and I am their Lord. Now, Egypt, again, is often a reference to the world. Not just the nation of Egypt becomes symbolic in biblical prophecy of that which is the world, the unbelieving world outside of Christ, those who worship a multitude of gods and serve their own selfish sensory interests. Well, one of the things he says is, I will bring my people out of Egypt and restore them into the land. Well, we know he did that back in 1450 BC when Moses led the children of Israel out of the captivity of Egypt, and eventually Joshua led them into the land of promise. But he's going to do it again. He's not the literal Egypt that's south of Palestine or Israel, but the Egypt which is the world system. I'm going to call my people back into Israel. They're going to make Aliyah again into the land of Israel. And it's interesting because it was only a few years ago that the population of the Jews living in Israel equaled and surpassed the number of Jews that were living in the rest of the world. So the Jews, as Mark Twain said, they're nothing but a puff of powder in the horizon of the atmosphere. They're such a small group of people, less than 1% of the world's population. And yet he said they will be the center upon which God focuses his work in the last days. And how is he going to do it? He's going to draw them back into the land as he has been doing since the 1880s, and they will become a troublesome stone in the shoe of the nations of the earth, and God will make it the point of final fulfillment of his plan of redemption, which comes to an end at the end of the tribulation. In the midst of the battle of Armageddon, Christ descends from the heavens. He comes in glory. He sets his foot on the Mount of Olives, and he wipes out the enemies. And it's there on the Temple Mount that Ezekiel's temple is rebuilt, the temple that exists during the millennial period where the Messiah will reign over the kingdoms of the world for 1,000 years. As you can see, I take these things very literally because there is nothing in the text that suggests that it should be understood anything other than literally. And the only reason people didn't take it literally is because they couldn't imagine, given the circumstances of the world prior to the modern age, that these things could be fulfilled literally. But we're living in a time where we can see things coming together in a way that was unthinkable just 100 years ago. And they seem to be aligning themselves with God's promise to not only rapture his church before the tribulation, to come for his church, and then return with his church in the second coming at the end of the tribulation period. I hope that made sense. As you can tell, I get kind of enthusiastic every time I start talking about this, because this is, for me, the most exciting thing that I see in the future. I mean, I get troubled by the politics of the time and the world that we live in. And sometimes I think the world is filled with so much evil. And the more information goes out, as knowledge increases, as Daniel said in Daniel 12, the more we know about everything, the more we realize that the world is a very dark, deep, and evil place. But the hope of the believer is one day Christ will return and set up the world and put it in order so that it will be what he intended it to be when he first created man in the garden. God bless you. Go in his grace.